Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Murder on St. Mark's Place by Victoria Thompson. Narrated by Callie Beaulieu. 1. Sarah heard the wailing when she was still halfway down the street. She knew the sound only too well, the howl of a grief too great to bear, and she was certain she had arrived too late. A midwife by trade, she had been summoned to deliver the third child of Agnes Otto, a strong, healthy young woman whom Sarah had seen only a few days earlier. Everything had seemed fine then, but if Sarah had learned nothing else from her years of midwifery, she knew that things sometimes went terribly wrong when a baby was making its way into the world, no matter how strong and healthy his mother might appear to be. Certain of what she would find, and praying she wasn't too late to save at least one of them, Sarah picked up her heavy skirts and tucked her medical bag under her arm. Dodging the puddles left from the freak rainstorm yesterday that had dropped over an inch of rain in an hour's time, she hurried down the sidewalk, past the neat row of tenement buildings here on St. Mark's Place, in the heart of Little Germany, until she reached the one where Agnes Otto lived. The front door stood open to catch what little air stirred in the early July heat, and Sarah was up to the stoop and through it in an instant. Inside, the dark hallway was deserted, but the sound of weeping echoed down the stairwell. She followed it unerringly and found several women gathered on the landing above, just outside the door to the Otto's flat. They were crying and wringing their hands and sobbing into their aprons. That was when Sarah began to suspect that whatever was wrong was not what she'd been expecting at all. Then she saw the policeman. He stood just inside the flat, the brass buttons of his uniform straining over his big belly, sweat streaming off his face in the oppressive heat, and his expression oddly panicked. His presence relieved her on one level. Nobody called the police because a baby or a mother died in childbirth. But the police didn't just show up for no reason, either. Something terrible had happened, even though it wasn't the thing Sarah had most feared. "Oh, look, Mrs. Brandt has come," one of the neighbor women said, seeing Sarah. "Thank heaven you've come." The policeman turned to look at her, and his sweaty face brightened. "The midwife's here now, missus," he said to someone inside, someone who was crying more loudly than any of the women in the hallway. "I'll just be on my way. Someone will let you know when you can claim the body." The body? Good heavens, what was he talking about? Had something happened to Agnes's husband? No wonder everyone was hysterical. "What's going on here?" Sarah demanded of the policeman, but he was in too much of a hurry to leave. He tipped his hat as he passed, but he did pass, as quickly as he could push his way through the group of women and squeeze by Sarah, and then he hustled his bulky frame down the dark stairwell and was gone. "It is Mrs. Otto's sister, Gerda," one of the women obligingly explained, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Somebody has murdered her." The words brought back ugly memories that Sarah had worked very hard to store away forever. Her own husband had been murdered a little more than 3 years ago, and just last April, Sarah had helped solve the murder of another unfortunate young woman. Although she sometimes had to deal with death in the course of her work, that, at least, was natural. She'd hoped never again to encounter the kind that came unnaturally, from the violent hand of another. Sarah didn't have to push her way into the Otto's flat. The women parted to allow her to enter, apparently as grateful for her arrival as the policeman had been. Agnes Otto sat at the table in her small kitchen with her head on her arms, sobbing as if her heart would break. Plainly, Sarah would get no straight answers from her. She turned to the women still hovering in the doorway. "Is she in labor?" "We do not know," one of them said, "but we were afraid with the shock of it." Sarah nodded. Shock had a way of hurrying things along, and Agnes was due any time now. Sarah set her medical bag on the table and started to unbutton the jacket that fashion dictated she wear out in public, in spite of the heat. From the front room of the flat, the one facing the street, Sarah could hear the cries of a young child. That would be Agnes's daughter, who was about 2. Looking around, she found Agnes's son, a boy of about 4. He was huddled in the corner, practically under the sink, and staring at his mother with wide, terrified eyes. "Would one of you take care of the children, please?" Sarah asked as she rolled up her sleeves. "They shouldn't be here." Two of the women hurried to do her bidding, removing the children from the flat and leaving her alone with Agnes. "Do you want me to send for your husband?" Sarah asked, gently stroking the other woman's shoulders in a gesture of comfort. Agnes didn't hesitate. She shook her head vehemently, then made an effort to raise her head. Her usually pale face was swollen and blotched with weeping. She brushed at her running nose with the cuff of her sleeve and said, "He will not come. He would lose his day's wages." Some men would count that a small cost to be able to comfort a pregnant wife, but Agnes knew her husband better than Sarah did. "How are you feeling? Are you having any pains?" Pains? As if she'd forgotten for a moment that she was pregnant. Agnes sat up in the chair and wrapped her arms protectively around her distended belly. Then she looked at Sarah and seemed to recognize her for the first time. "9. I don't think so." "Why have you come?" she asked in alarm. "One of the neighbor boys came for me. I thought it must be your time." "I did not send for you. I did not think of anything but—" Her voice broke as she remembered her sister, and she covered her face with her hands. "I guess your neighbors thought you might need me." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down beside Agnes. "Can you tell me what happened?" For a long moment Sarah was afraid Agnes wouldn't be able to speak, but she continued to stroke her back and croon meaningless phrases of comfort until at last she was rewarded for her patience. Slowly, Agnes lowered her hands, revealing eyes filled with so much pain Sarah had to force herself not to look away. "It is Gerda, my little sister. You remember her?" Sarah nodded. Gerda was a lively young girl of about 16, with blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes, who had come to America less than a year ago to live with her married sister. Her parents had hoped she'd do as well as Agnes had, find a suitable husband and a good life here. She had a job in one of the sweatshops, where she would have earned enough to pay Agnes and her husband, Lars, for her keep, but not much more. Sarah vaguely recalled Agnes's concern for her. "You were worried about her, weren't you?" Agnes nodded, shuddering under a fresh onslaught of tears. "She would not listen. She would not stay home like a good girl. She was only 16. Once again the tears choked her, and Sarah had to wait, her own eyes welling with tears as she thought of a life so young being snuffed out. As much to distract herself as to help Agnes, she got up and fetched a glass of water from the pitcher and helped her patient drink it when she was calm again. "Life is much different here than it is in Germany," Sarah suggested. "I expect Gerda had some trouble adjusting." Agnes's expression grew instantly angry. "She had no trouble. She was like an American girl at once. As soon as she started working with those other girls, they are bad ones. They got Gerda in trouble all the time. Trouble. Staying out late at night so she would be too tired to get awake in the morning for work. Going dancing, meeting strange men." Agnes shook her head in despair, and Sarah noticed she was rubbing her side without even realizing it. Sarah glanced at the pendant watch she wore pinned to her shirtwaist, making note of the time. "Lars tried to tell her," Agnes explained, desperate to make Sarah understand that they had attempted to stop her. "He told her those men would not marry a girl who goes to dancing all the time and stays out half the night. But she would not listen. She would not listen to anyone. I know something bad will happen. I tell her that." "And what did happen?" Sarah asked as gently as she could. Agnes squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could close out the pain. "She did not come home last night. Lars, he goes out to look for her, but he cannot find her anywhere. No one can find her. I hardly sleep all night for fear. And then that police comes here. A police! To my house!" Her eyes pleaded with Sarah to understand her outrage, and Sarah had no trouble doing so. In Germany, the police would never have occasion to visit the home of a respectable family, and the same was true in America. Then Agnes's botched and swollen features crumbled under the weight of her grief again. "They find her today. In an alley. She was... her face..." It was all she could do to choke out the words. "The police said someone beat her." "She was beaten to death?" Sarah asked when Agnes hesitated, the words as painful to say as they were to hear. "Only 16 years old, and beaten to death like an animal. Agnes nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. She took another sip of the water. They could not tell, from her face, who she was. Sarah couldn't stop herself from grasping at this last fragment of hope. Then maybe it wasn't Gerda at all. How can you be sure if... Her shoes, Agnes said, her voice barely a rasp. Her what? Her shoes. She had new shoes. They were red. She said the word as if it were vile. Red shoes, she repeated, silently asking if Sarah had ever heard of such a thing. She had not. How unusual. She said she bought them herself. She said she saved the money by walking to work instead of taking the trolley. But she could not have saved so much money herself. Someone gave her those shoes. A man. Agnes's light blue eyes flared with fury. We knew it, but we could not stop her. She would not listen, and now the police comes here to tell me my little sister is dead. She started to cry again, and once more Sarah saw her rubbing her side. A glance at her watch told her the contractions were only a few minutes apart. Agnes was in advanced labor. I think you should lie down for a while, Sarah said. You have to think of yourself and the new baby. Come on, I'll help you. Agnes looked around as if she had suddenly remembered something important. My children. Where are my children? Mrs. Schultz and Mrs. Naugerbauer took them so you could get some rest. They'll be fine. My babies! Agnes wailed as Sarah helped her to her feet. But the shifting of her weight resulted in a gush of fluid from beneath her skirt that succeeded in distracting her completely. Her water had broken. Mein Gott! She cried, and began to mutter hysterically in German as Sarah half led, half carried her into the bedroom. 2 hours later, Sarah was washing her hands at the kitchen sink when one of the neighbor women brought over a plate covered with a napkin. Mr. Otto will be hungry when he comes home, Mrs. Schultz explained, setting it down on the table. She was a short woman of ample girth who took great pride in the neatness of her appearance. How is Mrs. Otto doing? She's fine. She had another little girl. Already? I didn't hear a thing. The labor went quickly. Sarah didn't mention that the baby had hardly cried. That worried her. That and the way Agnes had shown hardly any interest in the child. Sarah had made sure the baby nursed before Agnes fell into an exhausted sleep, but she was very much afraid Agnes's milk wouldn't come in if she didn't calm down soon. Unfortunately, Sarah couldn't think of any way to help her, short of bringing Agnes's sister back to life. Did she tell you what happened? Mrs. Schultz asked. To her sister, I mean. A little. Sarah admitted wanting to hear the facts of the case from someone less emotional about them. She said Gerda was killed. Someone beat her like a dog and left her to die in some filthy alley, Mrs. Schultz informed her righteously, folding her arms under her ample breasts. She was also of German descent, but had been in America long enough to have lost most of her accent. Do they know who did it? Sarah asked, drying her hands on one of Agnes's immaculate towels. No, and they never will find out either if you ask me. That girl, she got just what she deserved. What did she expect, going out every night flaunting herself at those dance houses? No decent girls go to those places, I can tell you that. I'm sure she was only trying to have a good time, Sarah said, for some reason feeling obliged to defend the dead girl. Maybe because she was so young. Sarah could remember what it was like to be so young and wish for freedom and happiness. A good time, Mrs. Schultz scoffed. Girls don't need to have a good time. They should stay at home and help their mothers until they find a respectable man and get married. It's not natural for a girl to get work and go out alone with no chaperone to protect her. And this is what comes when she does. She ends up dead in an alley. Sarah glanced at the door into Agnes's bedroom, which she'd left open because of the heat. Fortunately, Agnes still seemed to be sleeping soundly, oblivious to the judgments of her neighbor. Still, she pushed the door closed, not wanting to cause Agnes any more pain than she'd already suffered. Young women have to work nowadays, Sarah reminded her. Agnes and her husband couldn't afford to keep Gerda if she didn't pay her share of the expenses. Ugh! She didn't have to run wild, though, did she? Going out every night wearing those fancy clothes that she couldn't afford on her wages. Not after she gave most of them to Mr. Otto for her board. And those shoes! I heard the policeman ask Agnes if her sister owned a pair of red shoes. That's how they knew it was her. Everybody in the neighborhood knew about those red shoes, and everybody knows what kind of a girl wears red shoes. Yes, a girl who is now dead, Sarah reminded her grimly. Mrs. Schultz huffed, plainly annoyed that Sarah wouldn't join her in condemning Gerda. I must get back. My own husband will be home soon. Sarah wasn't sorry to see her go. Sarah looked in on her patient again and found Agnes awake, her eyes brimming with tears. She'd overheard at least part of the conversation. That is what they will say about my Gerda now, Agnes moaned. They will say she was a bad girl. They will say she deserved to be murdered, and no one will care that a poor German girl who worked in a shirt factory died in an alley. No one will bother to catch the man who did it, and no one will ever be punished. Sarah knew this was true, so she had few words of comfort to offer. At least Gerda has you to mourn her, she offered. She was not a bad girl, Agnes insisted, trying to make Sarah understand. She only wanted to be free. That is what she says all the time. She wants to be free, with no one telling her what to do. That is why she left Germany. She did not want our father telling her what to do and what man to marry. She wanted to make a new life for herself here in America, where she could decide for herself what she did. The same way Sarah had left her own father's house and married the man of her own choice instead of her father's. When Tom had died, again Sarah had decided to make her own way instead of moving back to her father's house. She wanted to be free, just like Gerda. She'd found a way to make her own living and her own life, just the way Gerda had tried to do. She'd simply been more successful at it than the dead girl had, because Gerda had met a man who had stolen her choices from her. There, but for the grace of God, go I, Sarah couldn't help thinking. The police. They will not care who killed my Gerda, will they? Agnes asked. Sarah could have lied to escape an awkward moment, to make Agnes feel better even though she knew the lie would do more harm than good. But because she did know, she told the truth. The police might investigate if you could offer them a reward for finding Gerda's killer. Agnes shook her head, tears running down her face. We have no money for a reward. Of course they didn't. And justice in New York City was only for the rich. Unless... I have a friend, Sarah heard herself saying. A small lie. She and Frank Malloy weren't exactly friends. He's a police detective. I could ask him to help. He might be able to do something. Agnes clasped Sarah's hand in both of hers. Please, she begged. It is all we can do for Gerda now. Someone in the building was cooking cabbage for supper, or maybe everyone was. With cabbage it was hard to tell. The thin walls were also a little barrier to the sounds of life within the flat she passed as she climbed the stairs to the second floor. A baby was crying in one. A mother screamed at her child in another. Pots clanged against each other as women prepared the evening meal, and the smells of cooking combined with the smells of rotting garbage from the streets to form a miasma of decay that seemed to hang over the entire city. Sarah remembered the door. She remembered the last and only time she'd come here, just after she and Malloy had solved the murder of a young girl Sarah had known all her life. She'd left on good terms with Malloy that day, but certainly he'd never expected to see her again. Just as she'd never expected to see him again either. Not that she was going to see him now, of course. She'd been fairly certain he wouldn't be home in the middle of the day. No, she just wanted to get word to him, and going to his home seemed much more sensible than going to police headquarters. The last time she'd sought him out at the Mulberry Street station, she'd found herself locked in an interrogation room. Besides, she had another, very good reason for coming to his home. His son, Brian. She raised her gloved hand and knocked more loudly than she'd intended to. From the other side of the door she could hear the sound of grumbling, and then the door opened. The woman on the other side was small and sturdily built, her iron-gray hair pulled fiercely back into a bun. She looked ready for anything, but she was not ready to see Sarah Brandt. Her wrinkled face grew slack with surprise for an instant, before it hardened into anger.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?